Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. This operation will continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat.
This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowing to continue operations against Iran for as long as it takes. Israel launching a series of airstrikes at Iranian nuclear sites. Tehran warning of a harsh response against the U.S. and Israel. Oil surges as much as 13% amid fears of a wider war in a region that accounts for a third of global crude production. Brent rising the most since March of 2022. It's just gone past 8 a.m. across the Emirates, 6 a.m. here in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg, and we are, of course, following those developments overnight, those breaking news developments about Israel attacking Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. We're seeing how the markets are reacting to. We were just mentioning there how we've seen quite the biggest move coming in the face of oil right now. Brent crude up just under 9% there, trading about $75.48 a barrel. And of course, all of this coming amid these escalating tensions in the Middle East that, as we were just mentioning there, accounts for a majority, a third of global crude production. S&P futures, and we're also seeing really a risk-off mood setting into the markets as we digest these developments. S&P futures down just about 1.5% there, just over 1.5% there. Continuation of really what's been a negative day for Asia as well. The U.S. 10-year yield at 4.34% there. Not too many moves, of course. We have been watching the developments in the U.S. With the U.S. economy and tariffs, as well as the trajectory of the U.S. economy. But really the focus is on what is happening in the Middle East. Gold, of course, up just over 1% there. And we're seeing gold nearing a record, again, off the back of a lot of these developments. The question is, how far does this escalation go, and what does this mean for the wider markets? But just a closer look at what we're seeing with Brent crude. We were mentioning the moves that we're seeing right now. Haven't seen these moves in quite some time. And actually, as this chart is showing, Brent crude surging right now. Oil prices surging the most in 5 years right now, nearing a 10% surge. Of course, we've seen that come down just a bit. But the real question is, what does this disruption look like to global crude prices? Now, let's get back to the top story and dig into it a bit more. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has followed through on his repeated threats to strike Iran and try to cripple its nuclear program. Israel is now bracing for retaliation after Iran's news agency says its strikes killed several people, including the head of the Revolutionary Guards. The U.S. says it's not involved and has warned Iran against targeting U.S. assets. Bloomberg's Israel bureau chief, that's Ethan Bronner, is joining us now from Tel Aviv. Ethan, if you can, give us the latest into what we've been seeing over the past few hours.
Hi, Jennifer. Well, I think you've done a great job of saying what's happened in the last few hours. As you said, Israel at around 3 a.m. local time launched a fairly large number of attacks across Iran. It took out a number of its military leaders as well as its nuclear scientists. It attacked a number of its nuclear facilities. It's a little hard to know how much damage it's done to those because a lot of them are deep, deep underground, and Israel doesn't have the bunker busters that the U.S. has. But anyway, it's going ahead. As the Prime Minister said, it could take days. I've been told that it's expected to take about 2 weeks. And as you said, Israel is now in a kind of state of emergency. Its airspace is closed. Schools, work, and so forth have been canceled for the day as it braces for retaliation. Last year, Iran shot several hundred ballistic missiles at Israel. And Israel, will be able to take some of those out in advance for sure. Last time it had the help of a number of allies. I think its allyship is reduced now. I assume the U.S. will help it again, despite the fact that the U.S. didn't participate in this attack and said it didn't want it to go forward. My sense is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been talking with President Trump, and that President Trump has sort of taken a public stand against it, but perhaps a private stand that's a little more accepting of it.
Well, and Ethan, you just alluded to that there. We had been reporting that apparently there had been talks between Netanyahu and President Trump. Israel said it wouldn't move unless those talks failed. And we were also expecting talks and negotiations to happen over the weekend. How did we get here? Why did this escalate so quickly?
It'll be a while before we can truly answer that question. I can tell you what the Prime Minister and the military establishment here said this morning. They said that in recent weeks they have been able to see that Iran has been secretly and rapidly moving toward weaponization of its highly enriched uranium. It was in the process of creating the conditions to build at least 9 atom bombs in the coming months, and it was getting to a point of no return that Israel could not wait for. It decided also that based on what it says is its intelligence, that Iran was conceivably going to give its proxies in the region, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and so on, that kind of weapon, and that would have been curtains for Israel, at least as it sees it. So it argues that it had no choice. We will only know as history gives us some time to look at it later.
Ethan Bronner, Bloomberg's Israel Bureau Chief. Ethan, thank you so much for starting us off today. Really appreciate it. Let's dig into this even more with Ryan Bohl, Senior Middle East and North Africa Analyst at RANE. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us. So we were just speaking there with Ethan, who said that it looked like Iran was getting to the point of no return. How do you react to what we've been seeing overnight?
Well, certainly this is a very sudden escalation, but in a certain way, it's not a surprise in the broader dynamics. Israel's patience with Iran and its development of its nuclear program, as well as the diplomatic process to try to defang that program, was wearing thin. But there was also a strategic opportunity. The Assad government in Syria fell last December. Israel struck Iran twice last year, and it didn't result in a regional war. Iran's air defenses were already destroyed in a significant way in one of those strikes. So Israel's government really believed that they had a window of opportunity, and then they've chosen today, of all days, to act on it.
And Ryan, we're getting a number of reports about potentially what the damage could have been like in the region. I mean, what is your sense of how much damage can actually be done at this point in time, and how this will affect really what we see moving forward?
Well, it's going to be a level of uncertainty as to how much the Israelis are able to physically harm the Iranian nuclear program. There are assumptions that go into an assessment of how much damage they can do. Those assumptions involve that Iran has buried many things, it's hardened many facilities, it has some in secret. It has, the ability to move facilities or equipment around, and none of that will be terribly clear in the near term. What is certain is that Israel has carried out very disruptive attacks. Even if they haven't necessarily been destructive, whatever Iran was doing on the nuclear front, at least in the near term, has halted. As long as Israel is in the skies, the Iranians have to pause their research and try to find ways to survive this onslaught. And then in a few weeks, when this is over, or even a few months, that will be when we'll be able to assess whether or not this really significantly set the Iranian nuclear program back. But that being said, Israel's target set is very significant in terms of us understanding where does escalation go from here, because the Iranians have to respond. They will strike back. It's a question of where they strike back. Do they decide to stick to Israel? Is this an Israel-Iran war? Or do the Iranians decide at some point to expand their target sets to other countries they believe helped the Israelis out? For example, the United States and its regional bases in places like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, Brian, can you talk about that a bit more? Because, again, we have been reporting that President Trump had wanted this to be resolved diplomatically. So how does the U.S. factor into all of this? Potentially, could this have been avoided if the U.S. stepped in maybe earlier?
Well, certainly. This could not have happened without a U.S., at least we could call it a yellow light, a proceed with caution kind of signal from the White House. There's a reason that even under the Biden administration, when the nuclear talks were going nowhere, the Israelis were very restrained in how they reacted to Iranian provocations last year. The Biden administration was less likely to green light or yellow light an operation like this. The Trump administration is calculating that the Israelis can assume all of the risk for these strikes and that as a result of these Israeli strikes, it might just break the dynamic that has led to a stalemate in the diplomatic talks. So really, Trump is allowing the Israelis to escalate in a belief that it might de-escalate later, and that if it doesn't, all of the risk falls on the Israelis. It's really unclear whether or not that gamble is going to pay off. There are strategic reasons to believe that the Iranians want to keep this war with the Israelis alone and not expand it to the United States, let alone the Gulf Arab states. They're very mindful of what happened to Saddam Hussein, who got into his own international confrontation over weapons of mass destruction. And so they don't want to repeat that history. But that being said, the people that the Israelis have reportedly killed tonight may give the Iranian political leadership little choice but to expand the war.
What's a worst-case scenario here, Ryan? It seems as if we are in a certain worst-case scenario, but how much further does this get, in your opinion?
Unfortunately, it really can't get worse. Right now, kind of the baseline assumption is that Iran will fire back at Israel. It will attempt to destroy some of their military facilities like they did last year. They may strike some of the cities like Tel Aviv, where Mossad headquarters is, and Mossad was instrumental in carrying out this operation, so it would be a clear target for revenge. And that could result in civilian casualties inside of Israel, and that could be significant civilian casualties, the likes of which Israel hasn't seen since October 6th, 2023. But that being said, if the Iranian political leadership, particularly if the hardliners within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard have the upper hand in the arguments right now, the Iranians could choose to expand their target set. They could choose to strike other facilities that they believe assisted in this operation. And that would almost certainly mean some American facilities throughout the region. And then it's a question of whether or not they decide to finally pull their energy weapon. Do they decide to turn the Strait of Hormuz into a version of the Red Sea? They don't necessarily have to attack every single ship going through the Strait of Hormuz. They just have to threaten to attack the Strait of Hormuz, and that could cause traffic to plummet to zero and oil prices to skyrocket. Now, that would backfire on the Iranians in the long run. It hurts their ally, China. It would upset the Russians, and it would result in the United States intervening to reopen the straits. But that is something that hardliners within Tehran are almost certainly arguing should happen right now.
Ryan, let's just finish on what we've heard. We've gotten our first comment from a Gulf state, Oman, saying that it holds Israel responsible for this escalation. Is there anything that some of these Gulf neighbors can potentially do to step in here and again, de-escalate the situation? We've talked about the U.S. and potentially what that involvement looks like. How do these Gulf nations play into this?
Almost all of them will try to signal very much that they had nothing to do with these strikes and maintain their overall neutral stance. The other thing that they will do is signal that if the United States is dragged into this conflict, the U.S. cannot use the bases in the GCC to strike Iran. That's what they've done before, and that's something that makes a great deal of sense given their security interests. And then meanwhile, all their backdoor channels to the Iranians, I'm sure that every phone is ringing, every text message is being sent, trying to ensure that the Iranians understand that the Gulf Arabs from the UAE to Kuwait to Saudi Arabia have no interest in escalation or taking part in a military campaign against Iran. I think Iran will be generally rather receptive of that message. They don't need another flank to deal with at this moment. But the reality is that events may run away from them, and Iran's hardliners may decide to attack targets that are sensitive to Gulf interests anyway.
Ryan Bohl, Ryan, your analysis is invaluable. Really appreciate it. Senior Middle East and North Africa analyst at RANE. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us. Now, coming up, we stick with our top story. Israel strikes on Iran, injecting fresh geopolitical risk into oil markets. A closer look at that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. We want to bring you some breaking news again on the developments overnight that we did get in the Middle East. And the latest is a report coming from Iranian state TV, and that is that Iran's armed forces chief of staff was among those killed in the Israel strikes in the region. Of course, we have been reporting that a number of senior officials and also nuclear scientists were potentially targeted in this initial strike. And what we are hearing at this point in time is potentially Mohammad Bagheri, the chief of staff for Iran, was likely among those eliminated and killed. And that is just the latest coming into our newsroom. And of course, we are going to continue to follow this story all throughout the morning. Let's get to the market reaction, though. Oil surged after Israel's wave of military strikes against Iran, raising fears of fresh confrontations across a region that accounts for a third of global crude production. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Stephen Stupczynski. So, Stephen, of course, we are seeing crude now up more than 9%. How much higher is your expectation that we'll see crude? How much higher do you think crude will actually go?
You know, I think it really depends on Iran's reaction right now. I think, you know, the market is digesting Israel's strike. We've got some reports, right? We know that they're on nuclear facilities, which is a ratcheting up of pressure than previous strikes on Iran. But we also know, according to local media, that oil infrastructure appears to not be hit. So this is really important because I think there are two ways that the market views this. What is the risk of a wider conflict between Israel and Iran? But also, what is the risk of actual physical oil on the water? And if you know, Iran is a major producer of oil. If they had actually hit infrastructure that would curb the export of their fuel, you know, they are sanctioned by the United States, but they do export quite a bit on shadow fleet vessels. If that ability were curbed or restrained, that you would see likely a bigger impact on the short-term market because that supply would have to be rerouted. Maybe you would see other members of OPEC increase supply to meet that. Now, the other risk, which is a bit more remote, is what is the impact on the Strait of Hormuz? It is unlikely, as we heard from guests just previously, it's a possibility that Iran could decide or try to shut or cause some sort of traffic situation in the Strait of Hormuz that would curb oil and liquefied natural gas out of the region. But doing so would harm the relationship with their neighbors, but also harm their economy because they also rely on that waterway. That is the worst case scenario for the oil market. If that does happen, you would see oil prices extend their surge because about a quarter of all global oil output goes through that Strait of Hormuz. So it is a situation that's being carefully watched. I think, at the moment, the market is really just trying to figure out what comes next and how does Iran respond.
Could this, Stephen, broaden out even wider than just crude right now? You were mentioning natural gas there. Is your expectation that potentially we'll start to see some price action in reaction to these events?
Yeah, so the European gas market will open up in about an hour and a half now, and you're likely going to see an increase in prices there as well. While there is no physical impact, I want to emphasize, there's still no physical impact on gas exports or gas supply in the market. This risk premium is likely going to also play into European gas, as you've seen with oil today as well. You're seeing gold respond. Gold jumped up. It's now sort of near record high level, not quite there yet, but also very strong because if this does unwind into a larger conflict in the Middle East, into a larger war potentially, then you're going to see this risk-off mood and go into safe haven assets. And that, more often than not, over the last year has been gold. So that's another one that you've seen quite a bit of a gain today.
Bloomberg, Stephen Stupczynski. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Now, joining us now is Katrina Ell, Director of Economic Research at Moodys Analytics, to dig into more of the market reaction. Katrina, thanks so much for joining us. So Stephen was just highlighting there some of the initial reports that we're getting and potentially what the impact is on the energy sector. What is your reaction right now to some of the moves that we're seeing? We've seen oil come down a bit off of some of those highs we were seeing just initially after the initial attack.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly concerning to see the significant jump that we've seen in energy prices and broader commodities as well. And I think it comes at a really unfortunate time for the global economy, given the already heightened uncertainty and chaotic nature that we're dealing with coming out of the US protectionist stance as well. And if we drill down, for instance, into what that means in particular for Asia, it's a really unwelcome development, because we know, for instance, that Asia is disproportionately exposed to an export weakness coming out of the US tariff policy. And at the same time, what's been working in their favor is the fact that they do have low inflation. But if we do see a sustained rise in energy prices, for instance, globally, that's going to flow through to higher transport costs for Asia. And then that's really, unfortunately, going to limit the ability of central banks in the region to continue to provide rate cuts and really shore up domestic demand to try and best they can really insulate from the ructions overseas. So it's a hugely unwelcome development, and I think Asia is really incredibly vulnerable if we do see that sustained rise in commodity prices.
Are you surprised, though, Katrina, we're not seeing more significant moves in Asia in response to these initial reports?
I mean, I think it's probably too early to tell exactly what the financial market response would be, because I think there's so many different risks and developments that financial markets are currently pricing in. So it's not just about, the escalated tensions, of course, between Israel and Iran. It's also what we've seen overnight as well is more tariff threats potentially coming. And what Asia's really got a whole lot of anxiety is around, these reciprocal tariff rates. And we've got, for instance, that early July deadline looming large for if economies aren't able to organize and come up with a bilateral agreement with the US, then they are going to be subject, some of these economies in particular, to very high reciprocal tariff rates. So there's a whole lot of anxiety, and I think it really does bring in this idea that the risk aversion is really in play at the moment. And I think, we could see some significant emerging market currencies come under pressure as well, which of course will certainly add to imported inflation in the region as well. So again, really threatening that trajectory that Asia's inflation profile will be muted this year.
Katrina, when we look to some of the other market moves that we're seeing, we mentioned oil, we mentioned gold. How much further does this spread, and where do you expect to see even more maybe dramatic moves? I know we are waiting for more clarity on what exactly was damaged, but outside of those two assets, where else do you look to?
I think, the currencies and the stock market reaction would be critical here. And I mean, when we're looking at haven assets, given that we do have this prevalent risk aversion, playing out right now, it really is, where do we go? Because we know that the greenback isn't a currency that is, desirable at the moment for its historical haven status. So that's why we are seeing these significant rises in gold as a consequence. And so it is really difficult to see, it's difficult at this point, given the situation is evolving so quickly, exactly how financial markets are going to react. But I think, we just need to make sure that risk aversion is certainly the dominant theme that we're going to see, at least heading through next week.
And does it change, Katrina, your expectations for Fed cuts later this year?
I mean, at this point, no, because, we're not sure exactly how sustained this sudden spike in energy prices is going to be. I mean, what we're seeing at the moment in the US, the inflation trajectory is at this point supportive of ongoing rate cuts in the US. So we should see, around another 50 basis points worth of cuts delivered over the next couple of months. And so, that would be the main kind of view that we're projecting. But it's not just the energy price impact that we need to consider when it comes to inflation. It is, of course, what happens with the evolving tariff landscape. But I think what's working in US inflation's favor is the fact that we have seen that the US has, genuinely stepped back on some of its aggression when it comes to tariffs. And so that should be supportive of a more subdued inflation outlook than what we might have been looking for a few weeks ago.
Thanks so much, Katrina Ell, Director of Economic Research at Moodys Analytics, digging into some of the market moves we've been seeing. And as you can see, negative on the red on the screen right now as we are digging into the latest story. Plenty more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. This operation will continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat.
This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowing to continue operations against Iran for as long as it takes. Israel launching a series of airstrikes at Iranian nuclear sites. Tehran warning of a harsh response against the U.S. and Israel. Oil surges as much as 13% amid fears of a wider war in a region that accounts for a third of global crude production, Brent rising the most since March of 2022. It's just gone past 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates, 6:30 a.m. here in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg, and we have been following the developing story overnight. Iran is warning Israel and the U.S. of what it described as a harsh blow after Israel has launched airstrikes against Tehran's nuclear program and ballistic missile sites. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the operation targeted Iran's nuclear scientists and generals, vowing to continue attacks for as many days as it takes to remove this threat. Iranian state television reported the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hussein Salami, has been killed in the attacks. For more on the market reaction, let's bring in Bloomberg MLive strategist Mark Cranfield. So, Mark, let's dig into some of the reaction that we're seeing right now and just start with the dollar. Actually stronger today. How sustainable is that?
In short, probably not very. That's partly because the overall macro picture for the dollar still remains pretty weak. It's no real surprise that it's getting a knee-jerk jump today. You would expect that. It's a very strong day of risk aversion today across asset classes. And going into this, of course, people were mostly short of the US dollar. It's been having a pretty rough time over the past few weeks. So positioning clearly was skewed in a way in which traders would want to cover that, and that means a bit of strength for the US dollar. But if you think about this in macro terms, the isolationist policy of the United States trying to distance themselves from what's going on here is a negative overall for the US in terms of how investors feel about their attitude towards the currency. So the fact that the US currency is up today is probably not something that will last very long. And then you bring the Federal Reserve into the picture as well, because this obviously is going to dampen expectations of growth, and that is going to be something the Fed will have to address next week, and people are expecting interest rate cuts there as well. That will undermine the US dollar. So although we're seeing a bit of strength today, it is probably something that is not going to last for too long.
Mark, what do you make of some of the moves that we're seeing with Bitcoin in particular? It's interesting that it's weaker today. Does that suggest potentially it's not necessarily a haven asset as some people were suggesting before?
I think it's showing, as we've been writing on Markets Live today, I think it really just shows that cryptocurrencies in general are really risk assets. They just move in tandem with the general ebb and flow of markets. In fact, if anything, they're most closely tied towards US equity markets. So there's actually been today a pretty strong correlation between the falls in the US futures. The NASDAQ S&P futures have been pretty much falling in line with the main cryptocurrencies. And it shows that it's the same kind of people involved in that game, particularly retail traders. They tend to enjoy trading short-term moves in equity markets and cryptocurrencies at the same time. So if they're suffering losses in the equity space, they would need to sell their cryptos to make up for some of those margin losses that they're seeing there as well. So it's becoming more like that rather than separating crypto to a different asset space.
Bloomberg's Mark Cranfield. Mark, thanks so much for joining us and giving us some of the market reaction there. Let's dig into our top story again. Saudi Arabia has now condemned Israel's attack on Iran, describing the incident as blatant. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Paul Wallace for more analysis. Paul, a lot of developments just in the past half hour that we've been on the air. Can you walk us through the latest?
Hi, Jennifer. Yes, we are getting some condemnation of the attacks now from regional states. Oman was the first one to react, saying this is a reckless attack by Israel that will undermine regional security. I think it's important to note what the U.S. has said. So the U.S. has just made very clear that it had nothing to do with these attacks, and it warned Iran against retaliating against American assets in the region. It didn't condemn Israel, and U.S. President Donald Trump said he was sort of fairly muted in his reaction. He said he knew in advance that it was happening, but beyond that, he didn't say too much. But certainly, this is the type of action by Israel that could spark a wider regional conflict. I think Israel knows that full well. It's bracing for a retaliation. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israeli citizens will have to be prepared to potentially spend long periods in air raid shelters, presumably over the coming few days and maybe in the coming weeks. This is an ongoing attack, and Netanyahu has said that it could carry on for several days.
And he also said, Paul, that the strike on Iran was, quote, very successful. What do we know about the extent of the damage and potentially the fatalities on the ground?
So in terms of the damage, it's still pretty unclear. Iran has said that its oil sites, or at least its oil refineries and oil storage tanks, were not damaged. It will probably take some time to work out how badly damaged its nuclear sites, which seem to be the main target of Israel's operations, how badly damaged they were. This is the first time Israel has ever gone after Iranian nuclear facilities like this with airstrikes, and this, from everything we've seen so far, I think we can say that it's easily the most extensive wave of airstrikes Israel has carried out against Iran. In terms of fatalities, we're not hearing much in the way of, let's say, mass civilian casualties, although it is still early days and early hours. But the head of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, a key component of Iran's military forces, the head of that has been killed, according to Iranian state media, which is a big blow to the Islamic Republic if that's confirmed. And there may well be more fatalities among senior Iranian officials.
Yeah, definitely still a developing story. Bloomberg's Paul Wallace joining us there. Paul, thanks so much. Let's dig into the story even more and bring in our next guest, Adam Ramey, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean of Social Science at NYU Abu Dhabi. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. We were just speaking there with our colleague, Paul, about potentially the latest that we know. Give us your reaction to what you know at this point.
Well, I mean, these attacks are absolutely astonishing on one level, but on another level, it's not surprising. I mean, Israel has threatened retaliation against Iran for its nuclear program for some time now. I think that there were some warning signs. In the United States, where I am right now. Incidentally, there's it's sometimes called the Dominoes Index. When the dominoes in the vicinity of the U.S. Department of Defense in Washington or in Arlington, Virginia, sees higher volume than usual, that signals that something major is about to happen, and that was going on from about 24 hours ago. And so we're seeing now the aftermath of this, which is the regional allies of the United States have to make make heads or tails of the situation, and so far the United States, as previous guests have noted, has not disavowed the strikes, but at the same time has sort of wiped their hands of the situation. That being said, I think that retaliation is going to be coming in the not too distant future. Israel knows this. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced for people to get into bunkers and to prepare for a fairly severe retaliation. And unlike the last time that Iran launched strikes against Israel, it's going to be a significant question as to whether or not other Arab neighbors in between Iran and Israeli borders undertake any actions, if at all, to thwart those.
Do you expect them to take actions, Adam? We've talked about a few of the regional neighbors responding. Is your expectation potentially they step in or they stay on the sidelines and watch this unfold?
Well, I mean, I think especially given Israel's diplomatic isolation in recent times, I think that they're far less likely to intervene this time than in the past. That being said, obviously, if any strikes were to pass over airspace of neighboring countries that those countries viewed as being potentially damaging to their own civilians, then of course they would take action. But I think that the significance of a retaliatory strike this time would be felt a lot harder in Israel than it was in the past.
Adam, what do you make of some of the rhetoric? We've talked about the U.S. response, what we've heard from President Trump, and potentially what he knew beforehand. What do you make of some of the rhetoric that we are getting from U.S. officials, as you were mentioning, disavowing any sort of involvement in this, and yet still suggesting that they want to be a part of negotiations if there are still going to be talks?
Well, I think that the Trump administration was certainly optimistic that they would be able to work out a deal with the Iranians, even though the rhetoric had heated up in recent days on that note. Trump recently concluded a very successful visit to the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, and the UAE. And in that visit, had heralded his ability to be a peacemaker and a deal maker, both financially and politically. And I think there was optimism. Certainly, I had optimism during President Trump's visit to the UAE that there would be some sort of negotiated settlement that would finally put to rest, at least for to the short to medium term, any sort of significant military operations. That being said, Israel's rhetoric has been consistent, and the United States, even in the midst of those negotiations, had a firm line that if Iran had showed any willingness to invest its energies and its industry into developing nuclear weapons as opposed to civilian nuclear technology, that would be a red line. And that is the grounds on which that the Israelis announced the basis for their attacks. They said very clearly that they had intelligence that suggested that Iran was imminently close to developing a nuclear weapon, and they needed to stop it before time ran out. And I think that's why the Trump administration, at least so far, has been trying to sort of walk back on one level, saying, we're not directly involved in this. But I think there's probably some within the administration, at least, they're happy that this strike happened, specifically because of fears of Iran actually having nuclear weapons at their disposal.
Right. So much to pay attention to. Adam Ramey, really appreciate you staying up and digesting some of this with us. Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean of Social Science at NYU Abu Dhabi, joining us there. Thanks so much. And right now you're looking live at Jerusalem. Israel says it has targeted Iran's nuclear sites. We've been continuing to follow this story all throughout the morning. And we're going to have the latest on how Iran is likely going to respond with Columbia University's senior research fellow. That's Karen Young. She will be up next. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. For more on how Iran is likely to respond to Israel after the strike that we saw overnight, let's bring in Karen Young, senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy for Columbia University. Karen, thanks so much for joining us. So Iran vowing to retaliate. What's your expectation for when and potentially what the scale of the response might be?
Well, this is the really more difficult question that everyone is asking right now, and we just don't know. And we won't know perhaps for some time when Iran chooses to respond. And I think for the region, this is, and certainly for oil markets, this is a very important question, because if the retaliation is beyond Israel's borders, and chooses to target U.S. facilities or perhaps oil infrastructure in the region, then this conflict changes considerably from where it is right now.
Karen, you mentioned oil there. We've seen oil backing off from the initial spike that we saw when we first got these reports. What do you make of the price action here? Do you expect more sort of a retreat for oil prices, or will this be sustained?
Again, it depends on how Iran responds, and it's not in Iran's interest to, impede the transit of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. So we would expect that to be a sort of last resort option. But for these states, for Israel and for Iran, this is an existential threat, and they're both going to be behaving in ways that they're, fighting for survival. So we could expect some very, very strange and unpredictable behavior. But in general, oil markets right now have been pretty flat. That's because we have such plentiful supply. OPEC Plus has been unwinding some of its cuts of the last couple years. And the sense that we are in the midst of some really uncertain trade tensions and movement in the global economy. So what's happened really since October 2023 is that we've seen these spikes when we've had direct attacks between Israel and Iran, and then markets tend to kind of settle back down again. But I think it's important in this case, what happened last night is that we saw markets respond very sharply, increases above 10%, 12% in ways that we hadn't really seen since the September 2019 attack on the Abqaiq facilities in Saudi Arabia. So as a proportion of the market's response, this is very serious. I do think it will settle a bit, but again, this is going to be a very volatile situation until we know how long the retaliations go back and forth, and where this sort of settles.
And what about the direct impact on Iran's nuclear program? This has really been, of course, the point of contention for the region. We don't yet know what the extent of that damage is, but does this ultimately dent what it is that they were trying to do moving forward?
Or on the flip side, it makes them even more intent to have that weapon as a self-defense. So this action could have very much an unintended consequence of putting Iran into a corner, of feeling that their existence is under threat, and that they have to move towards weaponization if they haven't started so already. And so, yes, these are all big, big questions which we don't have public intelligence about. If the Israelis know more than they're telling us, they will have to come forward with that, and the international community will want to know. But it is, certainly not something that anyone has a real sense of right now.
Karen, we do appreciate your insights, though. Karen Young, a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, joining us there. Thank you so much. Now, images on Iranian state television said the Natanz site in central Iran, one of the country's two main nuclear plants, was struck around 4:15 a.m. and showed thick black smoke rising from the area. Let's bring in Bloomberg's atomic diplomacy reporter. That's Jonathan Tyrone. Jonathan, we were just speaking to Karen there potentially about what this means for Iran's nuclear program. What is your assessment at this point?
Well, the strikes are going to make the challenge of accounting for Iran's nuclear program vastly more complicated. Don't forget, as of today, IAEA inspectors were in Iran an average of more than one time a day, visiting multiple sites. Iran has already announced a couple of weeks ago to International Atomic Energy Agency diplomats that any strike by Iran is going to prompt them to implement special measures regarding its fissile material, that is its enriched uranium, which is currently under seal and inspected. They have said that they would remove that material, bring it into a secure location, and then notify the IAEA after that operation had been taking place. So right now, as these strikes are going on, there's a big question mark hanging over where exactly that nuclear material is and where it's going to be destined for. as for Natanz and Fordo and the other sites, I mean, first of all, there's a great deal of redundancy built into the Iranian program. There are 2 enrichment sites, both of them heavily fortified, buried under hundreds of meters of dirt at Fordo's instance and tens of meters of concrete and steel at Natanz. And there's an additional site coming online that they just announced yesterday. So this is a vast industrial enterprise that covers a hugely challenging geography, and the idea that a night of strikes will disrupt it, possibly, but
And Jonathan, we've mentioned the U.S. is committed and they want to resolve this nuclear issue diplomatically. But as Karen was just alluding to there, potentially this emboldens Iran even more to sustaining their nuclear assets. How prepared do you think Iran was for this? And what does this mean for negotiations then moving forward?
Well, absolutely. Iran's United Nations ambassador was already on the record 2 days ago saying that, the diplomatic course we were already on before these strikes could result in them leaving the bedrock arms control treaty, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. That is what restricts the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. The only other country to have left that treaty is North Korea in 2003. 3 years later, they detonated their first nuclear device. So, this vastly complicates the effort to reach a diplomatic solution. The Europeans are threatening to bring so-called snapback United Nations sanctions into force before October. Iran has said that if that occurs, they will leave the NPT. So we are on a slippery slope of diplomacy that could make the situation worse.
Bloomberg's Jonathan Tyrone. Jonathan, really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much. Now, let's continue the analysis and bring in Bloomberg's Jerusalem reporter. That's Dan Williams. Dan, walk us through the latest that we have heard from the government there.
Well, as you've noted, since the early hours, this was a strike Israel conducted. It was arguably 20 years in the making, but it's also coextensive with this more than 20-month-old war in Gaza, which has effectively become a regional war against Iranian proxies and Iran itself. The latest from Jerusalem is that the Israelis have been warning citizens to prepare shelters, to take to shelters even, in anticipation of retaliation by Iran, which is believed to have several hundred ballistic missiles, possibly drones and cruise missiles as well, that are able to make that range. And also the Israelis are saying that what was seen overnight was potentially just the first wave, a very powerful first wave, a very formidable first wave, but the first wave of several attacks that are planned in the coming days.
What does this mean, Dan, for the relationship between the U.S. And Israel at this point?
Well, formally, publicly, there's really a daylight being established by both sides. However, I think it's clear that the Americans had forewarning about this. We did know going back almost 2 days that there was a drawdown of U.S. diplomats, military forces non-essential in the region. There was a forewarning there. So the question is behind the scenes whether this really was a defiance or something of a minuet, a diplomatic minuet, where both sides of this dance have agreed to present themselves as being independent parties, but understanding the rules of the dance, the steps that need to be taken. It helps the Americans to establish distance because that may shield U.S. assets against Iranian retaliation. It may also leave the door open for future diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran.
Is diplomacy, though, off the table, Dan? Is your expectation that we'll still potentially see negotiations over the weekend?
Well, again, the question is diplomacy on what terms? It was clear that the Iranians were balking at the U.S. demand for a cessation, a complete cessation of uranium enrichment. This is a core project the Iranians have worked on for many years now. It's important to them. Arguably, it's also a project they would need if they want to establish a military nuclear program that would give them a degree of independence in terms of producing missile material. Of course, they say this wasn't in the works, but as far as the U.S. was concerned, certainly with the encouragement and support of Israel, without that being dismantled, there would have been no point to such diplomacy. So the question is whether the Iranians, should there be diplomacy in the future, would be chastened by this attack, by the damage inflicted by this attack, to the point where they would be willing to review that core refusal to give up on uranium enrichment.
Really great to get you on the show and hear from you. Dan Williams, Bloomberg's Jerusalem reporter, joining us there in London. Dan, thanks so much. And let's just take a quick look at where markets are positioned. We mentioned much of the price action that we're seeing is in reaction to what we did see overnight from Israel attacking Iran's nuclear sites. We are seeing red on the screen, definitely a risk-off environment at this point in time. S&P futures down more than 1.5% there. NASDAQ 100 futures down also 1.7%, continuing on from what was a relatively negative session in Asia. Eurostock 50 futures also looking like a weaker session to start off. And a lot of this is just the markets waiting to really assess and digest what the extent of the damage is on the ground, and also what this looks like moving forward, as we've been speaking to our guests about all throughout the morning. Let's just take a quick look at oil as well. Also down, of course, we've seen the biggest move in more than 3 years, with Brent crude around $74.82 a barrel. That is it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. Stick with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.